Okay, so continuing on the trail of poor F-Droid security practices and GrapheneOS's copy pastas, we've got this whole security issues section on F-Droid and its security issues. We've gone over some of it in like a GitHub write-up before, but it's not an in-depth security review, nor is it exhaustive. It's to inform users so they can make responsible choices, not trash someone else's work. I have respect for any work done in the name of good intentions. Likewise, please don't misinterpret the intentions of the article. You have your own reasons for using open source, free library, whatever software, which won't be discussed here. A development model shouldn't be an excuse for bad practices and shouldn't lure you into believing that it can provide strong guarantees it cannot. A lot of information in this article is sourced from official and trusted sources, but you're welcome to do your own research. These analyses do not account for threat models and personal preferences. As the author of this article, I'm only interested in facts and not ideologies. So this is where a lot of people end up looking. Like, you've got a couple particular people that end up just discounting this statement completely when it comes to what they say to people. Is never do this, because in many ways their data is their ideology. And so they end up taking the data that they see and turning it into their ideology and discounting any other threat models or personal preferences. So yeah, to understand why this is a problem, you'll have to understand a bit about F-Droid's architecture. The thing is, it does very differently from other app repositories in the Android platform security model. Unlike other repositories, F-Droid signs all apps in the main repository with its own signing keys. At the exception of the very few reproducible builds, a signature is a mathematical scheme that guarantees the authenticity of the applications you download. So we saw this from Izzy on Droid takes the APKs from the developers and verifies a signature and doesn't build it themselves or sign it himself. Now, the developer is supposed to sign their own app prior to its upload on the distribution channel. You don't have both the source, except for the first installation. Future updates will have their authenticity cryptographically guaranteed. Issue with F-Droid is that all apps are signed by the same party, which is also not the developer. You are now adding another party you'll have to trust, since you'll have to trust the developer anyway, which isn't ideal. The fewer parties, the better. So this comes down to, are you getting it from their actual... You're trusting Izzy on Droid to have the proper signature attached to the APK. Or you can get it directly otherwise. So you've got to take into account the different levels. On the other hand, Play Store now manages the app signing keys too, as Play app signing is required for app bundles, which are required for new apps since 2021. These signing keys can be uploaded or automatically generated and are securely stored by Google Cloud Key Management Services. It should be noted the developer still has to sign the app with an upload key so that Google can verify its authenticity before signing it. With this app signing key for apps created before 2021 that may have not opted into Play signing yet, the developer still manages a private key and is responsible for its security. F-Droid requires the source code of the app is exempt from any proprietary library or ad service. According to their inclusion policy, usually that means some developers will have to maintain a slightly different version of their code base that should comply with F-Droid's requirements. Besides, their quality control offers close to no guarantees, as having access to source code doesn't mean it can be easily proofread. Saying Play Store is filled with malicious apps is beyond the point. The false sense of security is a real issue. Users should not think of the F-Droid main repository as free of malicious apps, yet unfortunately many are inclined to believe this. Now, this is the thing. I don't see this as the case. I know that it's fully possible to get malicious apps on there. You have some level of comfort knowing that many of them are going to be open source and have the source available, but as we've seen in the past, even open source libraries can have malicious code embedded into them in libraries in NPM that many people rely on. And sometimes it's a core library that gets infected with malicious code because some dude wants to protest something and thus break half the internet. But can't I just trust F-Droid and be done with it? You don't have to take my word for it. They openly admit themselves it's a very basic process relying on badness enumeration. This doesn't work, by the way, which consists in a few scripts scanning the code for proprietary blobs in known trackers. So they're looking for basic things, not like malicious things. So a tempting idea would be to compare F-Droid to the desktop Linux model, where users trust their distribution maintainers out of the box. This can be sane if you're already trusting the OS anyway. But the desktop platform is intrinsically chaotic and heterogeneous for better and for worse. It really shouldn't be compared to the Android platform in any way. While we haven't seen F-Droid controls assigning servers, F-Droid also fully controls the build servers that run the disposable VMs used for building apps. And from June 2022, the Rest VM officially ran an end-of-life release of Debian. F-Droid's answer, interestingly, largely unused, is build reproducibility. While deterministic builds are a neat idea in theory, it requires the developer to make their toolchain match with what F-Droid provides. Its additional work on both ends sometimes results in apps severely lagging behind in updates. Google's approach is code transparency for app bundles, which is a simple idea addressing some of the concerns with play app signing. JSON Web Token signed by a key private to a developer is included in the app bundle before it's uploaded to Play Store. Hashes end users. Code transparency has known limitations. However, not all resources can be verified, and this verification can only be done manually. Since it's not part of the Android platform itself, despite its incompleteness, code transparency is still helpful, easy to implement, and thus something we should see more often as time goes by. Other app repositories, to my current knowledge, Amazon has always been wrapping APKs with their own code, and this means they were effectively re-signing submitted APKs. If you understood correctly the information above, Google can't do this for apps that haven't opted into Play App signing. As for apps concerned by Play App signing, while Google could technically introduce their own code like Amazon, they wouldn't do that without telling about it, since this will be easily noticeable by the developer and more globally researchers. They have other means on the Android app development platform to do so. Believing they won't do that based on this principle is not a strong guarantee, however. Hence the above paragraph about code transparency for app bundles. Huawei App Gallery seems to have a similar approach to Google, where submitted apps could be developer signed, but newer apps will be signed by Huawei. So F-Droid signs the apps with their own keys when they compile them, and they expect the developers to use a certain tool chain that can be very outdated. Whereas if you look at various other repositories, if you're sourcing your apps directly from the developer and they're providing APKs in their releases, then you may be able to get more up-to-date stuff. So you can have apps that will provide a Play Store APK, they will provide an F-Droid APK, and basically an independent release APK. What you can do is in Obtainium is pick which kind of APK you want to install, or you just manually install it otherwise. Some apps will self-update, so that when they detect that their home server has released an update, they will download the update and install it inside the app itself. So some apps are, in essence, self-updating. But again, this also relies on the fact that you have a properly signed APK, and this is kind of GrapheneOS's big thing, is F-Droid signs all APKs with their own signature, pretty much, for the most part. Izzy on Droid, on the other hand, doesn't sign the APKs. Izzy takes those APKs and the signatures, verifies them on the server, and then puts them up into the repo for you to download. So this is different from F-Droid's approach, which I think sometimes people on the GrapheneOS community discount. F-Droid's ridiculous inclusion policy and its consequences. To carry out its passion for FOSS on the Android platform requires the developers adhere to a strict inclusion policy for their apps to be hosted on the main repository. Requires source code to an app to exclude any proprietary libraries or ad service. Some developers have to maintain a slightly different version, not spending more time and energy, but also in some cases working with libraries and components that may be outdated. Restrictions imposed by inclusion policy have a knock-on effect on end users, as well as demonstrated in the following case with Snicket. In 2022, Snicket Project published a blog post that addressed users of their app who downloaded it from F-Droid. It sought to allay any panic from users if they received a warning from F-Droid telling them the app has a vulnerability and that they recommend uninstalling immediately. In a subsequent blog post, Snicket clarified that this warning from F-Droid wasn't entirely accurate, as the problem wasn't with Snicket itself, but specifically F-Droid's own build of the app that was an outdated version of the WebRTC library. So this is where, when people talk about using the official F-Droid client, that it will notify you of vulnerabilities. The vulnerability is in F-Droid's own toolchain in this case. Indeed, is the first blog post by the Snicket project details WebRTC pulled third-party binaries from Google's Maven repository, presumably to adhere to the parts of the inclusion policy that forbid the use of non-free dependencies and build tools. Were not affected by this. The developer-signed versions of Snicket published on the Play Store were not affected by the issue, for they were built with modern WebRTC. Furthermore, the second blog post by Snicket reveals how the older third-party version used their F-Droid app actually hindered the addition of new improvements to the app from upstream. So this is the case where sometimes if you can get it directly from the developer via applications like Obtainium or other repositories that are F-Droid compliant or compatible, like NeoStore and Droidify, you may get a better version than what F-Droid can provide. So again, it ultimately harms users by forcing app developers to adopt potentially decrepit development tools and build processes. So slow and irregular updates. So this is also an issue in desktop Linux, and it looks like this is a thing that he goes over, i.e. Manjaro and Ubuntu. Since you're adding one more party to the mix, that party is now responsible for delivering proper builds. It's a common thing among Linux distros and their packaging system. They have to catch up with upstream on a regular basis, but very few do it. Well, Arch comes to my mind. Others, like Debian, prefer making extensive downstream changes and delivering security fixes for a set of vulnerabilities assigned in a CVE. Yeah, it's as bad as it sounds, but that's another topic. Not only does F-Droid require specific changes for an app to comply with its inclusion policy, which often leads to more maintenance work, it also has a rather strange way of triggering new builds. Part of its build process seems to be automated, which is the least you could expect. App signing keys are on an air-gapped server, meaning it's disconnected from any network. At least that's what they claim, which forces an irregular update cycle where a human has to manually trigger the signing process. It is far from an ideal situation, and you may argue it's the least to be expected, since by entrusting all the signing keys to one party, you could also introduce a single point of failure. Should their system be compromised, whether from the inside or out, this could lead to serious security issues affecting plenty of users. This is one of the main reasons why Signal refused to support the inclusion of a third-party build on the F-Droid official repo. While this GitHub issue is quite old, many points still hold true today, which is really sad because F-Droid has had, as we've gone over, things reported, and they have just ignored it or said, like, it doesn't matter. Considering all of this and the fact that their build process is often broken using outdated tools, you have to expect far slower updates compared to a traditional distro system. Slow updates mean that they will be exposed to security vulnerabilities more often than you should have been. It would be unwise to have a full browser updated through the F-Droid official repo. For instance, F-Droid third-party repos somewhat mitigate this issue for slow updates. Since they can be managed directly by the developer, it isn't ideal either, as you will see below. So, again, you get it from the developer. I mean, in many cases, I think GitHub builds, you can automate GitHub builds now and have it all signed and a release put together when you need it. So, there is that. Low target API for client and apps. SDK stand blah, blah, blah. On Android, a higher SDK level means you'll be able to make use of modern API levels, which each iteration brings security and privacy improvements. For instance, API level 31 makes use of all these improvements in Android 12. As you may already know, Android has a strong sandboxing model where each app is sandboxed. You could say that an app compiled with the highest API level benefits from all the latest improvements brought to the app sandbox, as opposed to outdated apps compiled with older APIs which have a weaker sandbox. This is a mere sample of the SE Linux exceptions that have to be made on older API levels so that you can understand why it matters. So I have a problem where I install an old Android app for my home screen. It's just the Majora's clock widget. And yeah, it turns out the official F-Droid client doesn't care much about this since it lags behind quite a bit, targeting level 29, 7.1, of which some SC Linux exceptions are shown above. As a workaround, some users recommend third-party clients like Droidify or NeoStore. While these clients might be technically better, they're missing features, poorly maintained, and also introduced yet another party to the mix. Furthermore, F-Droid doesn't enforce the minimum target SDK for the official repo. Play Store does that quite aggressively for new apps and updates. 2021, Play Store requires new apps to be targeted to at least API 30. November 2021, existing apps must target at least level 30 for updates to be submitted. While it may be bothersome, it's a necessity to keep the app ecosystem modern and healthy. F-Droid sends the wrong message to developers and users because they should care about it, and this is why many of us think it may be even harmful to the FOSS ecosystem. Backward compatibility is often the enemy of security, and while there's a middle ground for convenience and obsolescence, it shouldn't be exaggerated. As a result of this philosophy, the main repository is filled with obsolete apps from another era, just for these apps to be able to run on more than 10-year-old Android ice cream sandwich. Let's not make the same mistake as the desktop platform. Instead, complain to your vendors for selling devices with no decent OS firmware support. There's little practical reason for developers to not increase the target SDK along with each Android release. This attribute matches the version of the platform of an app is targeting and allows access to modern improvements, rules, and features on modern OS. The app can still ensure backwards compatibility in a way that it can run on older platforms. The min SDK attribute informs the system about the minimum API level required for the application to run. Setting it too low isn't practical, though, because this requires having a lot of fallback code by common libraries and separate code paths. At the time of writing, Android 9 is the oldest Android version that is getting security updates. 80% of Android devices in the world are running Oreo. So, lack of good practices. So the old Target SDK, Droidify and NeoStore, I would say it was. I think the third-party clients thing, is more of an issue of accessing F-Droid's official repos. Because you can still add other repos into F-Droid, and you're still introducing another point of failure at that point. With NeoStore and Droidify, you've got a more modern and up-to-date with a more modern SDK that you can take advantage of in those. What's the word? That F-Droid doesn't use. And so you change the point of failure from F-Droid to someone else, you just remove F-Droid's repo, and you've got access to the other repos available, like Izion Droid and so on. So lack of good practices, F-Droid client allows multiple repositories to coexist within the same app. Many of the issues highlighted above were focused on the main official repo, which most of the F-Droid users will use anyway. However, many other repos in a single app also violates the security model of Android, which was not designed for this at all. The OS expects you to trust an app repository as a single source of apps. Yet F-Droid isn't that by design, as it makes several repositories in one single app. This is important because the OS management APIs and features are not meant for this, and see F-Droid as a single source. So you're trusting the app client to not mess up far more than you should, especially when the privileged extension comes into the picture. There's indeed a serious security issue with the OS first-party source feature being misused, as the privileged extension makes use of the install packages API in an insecure manner. The privileged extension accepts any request from F-Droid, which again suffers from various bugs and security issues and allows user-defined repositories by design. A lot can go wrong, and bypassing security checks for powerful APIs should definitely not be taken lightly. On that note, it's also worth noting the repo metadata format isn't properly signed by lacking whole file signing and key rotation. Their index format uses jar signing, which has serious security flaws, and that work in progress in v2 format with support for APK signer, although the final implementation remains to be seen. As a matter of fact, the new unintended update API added an API level 31 that allows seamless app updates for app repos without privileged access to the system. Won't work with F-Droid as is. It should be mentioned that the aforementioned third-party client NeoStore supports this API. Although the underlying issues about the F-Droid infrastructure largely remain, indeed this secure API allowing for unprivileged, unattended updates not only requires the app repo client to target API 31, but the apps to be updated also have to be at least target level 29. The official client lacks TLS certificate pinning, is a way for apps to increase security, set up public key hashes, known good certificates, can avoid man-in-the-middle attacks, possible and lead to various security issues, trusting an app to deliver you apps. Certificate pinning is an important security and also straightforward to implementing using declarative networks. GrapheneOS Store uses this feature, pins both root and C8 certificate in their app repo client. The Play Store doesn't use certificate pinning exactly, but achieves a similar level of security by using a limited set of root CAs, including their own. Along the Play Store's use of package signing and properly signed metadata guarantees apps you download from the Play Store are genuine and delivered securely. Doesn't provide the same guarantee in F-Droid. Several times adding certificate pinning to their client, at least for the default repos. Relics of preliminary work can even be found in their current code base, but it's unfortunate they haven't been able to find any working implementation. They've thought several times about it. Given the overly complex nature of F-Droid, that's largely understandable. Let's see, new signature schemes, until they were forced by Android 11 requirements support v2, v3 schemes. Signing APKs with GPG is no better considering how bad PGP and its reference implementation GPG are. Ideally, F-Droid should fully move on to newer signature schemes and completely phase out the legacy signature schemes. Okay, give me a second while I search for some. Okay. So just real quick, kind of swimming around the NeoStore stuff, it looks like there is some sort of like signature pinning that goes on because it prevents apps from installing over other apps if they come from different repos. So like you can enable the Izion Droid repo or disable it and then it won't install the F-Droid one over it. But yeah, kind of trying to sift around for like TLS certificate pinning and what all. It might halfway be implemented there, but yeah, F-Droid, you can see even on the TechLore discussion forums, it's very heavily talked about, but yeah. So confusing UX, it's worth mentioning that their website has for some reason always been hosting an outdated APK of F-Droid, and this is still the case today, leading many users wondering why they can't install F-Droid on their secondary user profile, blah, blah, blah. Misleading permissions approach. F-Droid shows a list of the low-level permissions for each app. Low-level permissions are usually grouped into standard and special toggles that are explicitly based on the type of sensitive data, while showing a list of low-level permissions could be useful information for a developer. It's often misleading and an inaccurate approach for the end user, since Android 6 apps have to request standard permissions at runtime and do not get them simply by being installed. So showing all the under-the-hood permissions without proper context is not useful and makes the permission model unnecessarily confusing. F-Droid claims these low-level permissions are relevant because they support Android 5.1, meaning they support very outdated versions of Android where apps could have install time permissions. If a technical user wants to see the manifest, they can access the manifest easily, but this all is beyond the scope of the article. Anyone who cares about privacy and security wouldn't run an 8-year-old version of Android unless they're weird and using it for their MP3 player and has not received security updates for years. See MP3 player. A discussion about this took place in F-Droid's GitLab repo, and short F-Droid downplayed the issue with their misleading permission labels, proceeded to call the Android permission model a dumpster fire. Even apps targeting level 23 do not have permissions granted at install time on modern Android, which instead displays the legacy permission grant dialog whether or not permissions are granted at all. Time does not just depend on the app's target SDK. Even if this were the case, the OS installer on modern Android would have been designed to show the requested permissions for those legacy apps. Low-level permissions referred to in F-Droid as run on startup description when in fact this permission is not needed to start at boot and just refers to a specific time broadcasted by the system once it finishes booting. To be fair, short summaries used to be provided by the Android dock years ago, but the permission model has drastically evolved since then. Most of them aren't accurate anymore. Let's see. In modern Android, background restriction toggle is what really provides the ability for apps to run in the background. Some low-level permissions don't even have a security privacy impact and shouldn't be misinterpreted as having one. Anyhow, you can be sure that each dangerous low-level permission has a high-level representation that is disabled by default and needs to be granted dynamically to the app by a toggle or explicit user consent in general. Another example to illustrate shortcomings would be query all packages, low-level permissions. Play Store, for instance, conveys the permissions in a way less misleading way. The main low-level permissions are first grouped in higher-level user-facing toggles, and the rest is shown under Other. This permission list can only be accessed by tapping about this app, then app permissions, see more at the bottom of the page. Play Store will tell you the app may request access to the following permissions. This kind of wording is more important than it seems. And now the Play Store doesn't show that anymore. Play Store restricts the use of highly invasive permissions such as external storage, allows apps to opt out of scope storage if they can't work with more privacy-friendly approaches, apps that can't justify their use of permissions. GrapheneOS, I think, figured out the scoped storage thing pretty easily because it can fake giving access to like full storage while also limiting what it has access to. This is where an app repository can actually be useful in a review process to front-end users from installing poorly made apps that might compromise their privacy. Not that it matters much if these apps target very old API levels that are inclined to require invasive permissions in the first place. So far, you've been presented with reference facts that are easily verifiable. In the next part, I will allow myself to express my thoughts and opinions. You're free to disagree with them, but don't let that overshadow the rest. So this is the analysis comment. Some improvements could easily be made. I don't think F-Droid is in an ideal situation to solve all these issues because some of them are inherent flaws in their architecture. Core philosophy is not aligned with security principles expressed in the article. I can only wish for them to improve since they're one of the most popular alternatives to commercial app repos and are therefore trusted by a large user base. F-Droid is seen as the only way to get support open source apps. That's not the case. F-Droid could help you find apps, but that you wouldn't otherwise have known existed. Many developers publish their apps on the Play Store or directly at their website. Releases are available on GitHub, which is great since each GitHub releases page has an Atom feed. If downloading APKs from regular websites, you can use APK Signer to validate the authenticity by comparing certificate fingerprints against the fingerprint from another source. This is how you may proceed to get the app certificate. Also written above, the OS pins the app signature upon installation and enforces signature check for app updates. In practice, this means the source doesn't matter as much after the initial install. For most people, I'd recommend just sticking with the Play Store. Play Store isn't flawless, but it emphasizes the adoption of modern security practices, which encourages better privacy practices, and strange as it may sound, Google's not always doing bad things in that regard. This can't address the flaws related to Play Store itself. Again, the main topic is F-Droid, and yeah. Should I really care? It's up to your threat model, and of course your personal preferences. Most likely, your phone won't turn into a nuclear weapon if you install F-Droid on it, and this is far from the point that this article is trying to make. Still, I believe the information presented will be valuable for anyone who values a practical approach to privacy rather than an ideological one. Such an approach is partially described below. There's more malware in Play Store. How you can say it's more secure is explained above. It doesn't matter as you shouldn't really rely on any quality control to be the sole guarantee that software is free of malicious exploitable code. Play Store and even the Apple App Store may have a considerable amount of malware because of reverse engineering of any uploaded app isn't feasible realistically. However, they fulfill the role quite well. That is all that is expected of them. With Play App signing being effectively enforced for new apps, isn't Play Store as flawed as F-Droid? So this comment is repeated a lot. It would be dismissed be dismissing all the other points made in this article. Also, I strongly suggest you carefully read the sections related to Play app signing, preferably the official documentation on this matter. It's not a black and white question, there are many more nuances to it. Aren't open source apps more secure? Doesn't it make F-Droid safer? You can find your open source apps elsewhere. No open source apps aren't necessarily more private or secure. Instead, you should rely on the strong security and privacy guarantees provided by a modern operating system with a robust and sandboxing permission model, namely modern Android, GrapheneOS, and iOS. Pay close attention to the permissions you grant and avoid legacy apps as they could require invasive permissions. So it's the idea of know where your apps come from and try and be aware of what your apps are doing and only provide them with permissions that they need for your use case. When it comes to trackers, this really comes up a lot. You shouldn't believe in the flawed idea that you can enumerate all of them. Enumerating badness approach is known to be flawed in the security field, and the same applies to privacy. You shouldn't believe that a random script can detect every single line of code that can be used for data exfiltration. Of course, because we can find fun ways to exfiltrate your data that bypass what known lines of code there are. Data exfiltration can be properly prevented in the first place by the permission model, which again denies access to sensitive data by default. This is a simple yet rigorous and effective approach. So you see this even in some Linux application standards, because I think Flatpak now is in some ways similar to the Android sandboxing security model, where you can grant certain permissions to apps in Flatpak that will limit what it can see or give it more access to what it can see. So you see the same thing here. You have to determine what apps you're going to use and what permissions and access you give to it, which is where something like GrapheneOS can come in handy, is you are given the tools to give more finer-grained control to every app on your system. So you can define what apps have network access, what apps don't, where they have network access and where they don't, where they have storage access and where they don't, where they have contact access and where they don't, and so on. No app should be unnecessarily entrusted with any kind of permission. It is only if you deem it necessary that you should allow access to a type of data. This access should be as fine-grained as possible. That's the way the Android platform works. Regular apps run in the explicit untrusted app domain. And continues evolving. Contrary to some popular beliefs, usability in most productivity tasks can still be achieved in a secure and private way. Isn't Google evil? Isn't Play Store spyware? Some people tend to exaggerate the importance of Google in their threat model at the cost of pragmatism. In security, privacy, good practices, Play Store isn't spyware and can run unprivileged like it does on Graphene, including with unintended update support. On the vast majority of devices, though, Google Play is a privileged app and a core part of the OS that provides low-level system modules. In that case, the trust issues involved with Play app signing could be considered less important since Google Play is already trusted as a privileged component. So it's the So since Google already has system access to your phone in those systems where Google is a privileged app, Play app signing is lower on the totem pole because Google already has privileged access to your device and all the data on it, which I believe is, it could partially be a reason why Celebrite works as well as it does on many other Android platforms and is locked down on GrapheneOS. And GrapheneOS also has more hardening done to it as well. Play Store evidently has some privacy issues given its proprietary service, which requires an account. This cannot be circumvented, and Google services have a history of nagging users to enable privacy-invasive features. Again, some of these privacy issues can be mitigated by setting up the Play Services compatibility layer from Graphene, which runs Play Services and Play Store in the regular app sandbox. The solution could very well be ported to other Android-based operating systems. If you want to go further, consider using a properly configured account with the least amount of personally identifiable information possible. Note that the phone number requirement appears to be region dependent. So let's see. This is the part that I wish would somewhat happen. Because if we had GrapheneOS's hardening in AOSP, it would transition, so you could push it upstream to AOSP, and then it would be pulled downstream through every other project in custom ROM, which means that you harden the security of Android. And there have been inklings of Graphene developers threatening to do this, but they would rather gripe and for some reason they gripe and moan about other implementations of Android being insecure when they could push it upstream to AOSP and make it a moot point. And it's kind of, and there are some things where, yes, it's dependent on certain device trees or drivers to where some features can be implemented, like the USB hardware security level stuff. But like for the sandboxing and things like that, it would enhance so much with like the permission scopes if they would push that hardening upstream and then it could be pulled downstream to these other projects. And I don't get why they don't do that. But anyway, if you don't have Play services installed, you can use a third-party store client called Aurora Store. Aurora Store has issues, and some of them overlap. In fact, with F-Droid, Aurora Store somehow still requires legacy storage permission, has been known to sometimes retrieve wrong versions of apps, and distributed account tokens over clear text until fairly recently. Not that it matters much, since tokens were designed to be shared between users, which is already concerning. I'd recommend against using the shared anonymous accounts feature. You should make your own throwaway account with minimal information. Crescent is an up-and-coming app repository which strives to tackle the issue discussed here and more. Hopefully, Crescent or a project like it can flourish as a secure and open ecosystem for app delivery. It's also worth keeping an eye on the great work Graphene does on their feature app repository. It will serve as simple, secure, modern app repo, albeit only for a curated list of high-quality apps, some of which have their own builds. So, it's not an attack on F-Droid or their mission. It's meant as an informative piece for end users and a springboard for improvement of the F-Droid project. So this is more to keep you informed. And again, my comment on it is analyze your threat model. And if you're going to go with something, it might be more prudent to go with something like NeoStore Droidify over F-Droid. Just due to the model that F-Droid runs under and the number of things that they've ignored. I haven't looked at NeoStore or Droidify to see what things that they've ignored, but I could be totally bad pointing you in that direction. But that's where, from my viewpoint and what I can see, where it stands. If you liked the content, if you enjoyed it, if you think I deserve it, like, comment, subscribe, leave any criticisms you have or what have you. I appreciate it. Feed that algorithm, like I said, and I will see you guys in the next one.